October 27, 1981. Karlskrona Naval Base, Sweden. Captain Lars Höglund stood on the bridge of the Swedish destroyer Holland. Binoculars pressed against his face, scanning the gray waters of the Baltic archipelago. The autumn mist clung to the rocky islands like smoke, reducing visibility to barely 200 meters. Through his headphones, the sonar operator's voice crackled with barely contained excitement. Contact bearing 045, distance 800 meters. Definite submarine signature, sir. She's trying to hide in the thermal layer. For 3 days, the Swedish Navy had been tracking something in their territorial waters. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that kept appearing on sonar, disappearing into the complex underwater topography of Sweden's coast, then reappearing miles away. The hydrophone recordings were unmistakable. The distinctive cavitation pattern of a submarine's propeller. The low-frequency hum of a diesel-electric boat running submerged. Höglund lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. In 6 hours, the Swedish government would make a decision that would define their Cold War experience for the next decade. They would either force this submarine to the surface and prove that the Soviet Union had violated Swedish neutrality, or they would lose it in the maze of islands and inlets that lined Sweden's coast, leaving only questions and conspiracy theories. What neither Höglund nor his superiors yet understood was that this hunt would culminate in an international incident that would forever change Sweden's defense posture. Within 4 years, they would hollow out an entire mountain to hide their navy. Within a decade, they would transform from peaceful neutrals into a nation on permanent submarine alert, dropping depth charges in their own waters more than 200 times. The submarine they were chasing was about to run aground, and when it did, the world would learn that Soviet submarines had been mapping Sweden's coast for years, preparing invasion routes for a war everyone hoped would never come. In the comfortable conference rooms of Stockholm and Moscow in the late 1970s, both sides believed they understood the rules of Cold War neutrality. Sweden had maintained its non-aligned status since 1814, carefully navigating between NATO and the Warsaw Pact with a policy they called neutrality in peace, aiming at neutrality in war. Soviet leadership viewed Swedish neutrality as a convenient fiction, useful when it served their purposes, irrelevant when it didn't. The Baltic is practically a Soviet lake, KGB chairman Yuri Andropov told the Politburo in 1978, according to documents declassified after the Cold War. The Swedes protest, "We apologize. Nothing changes. They know their place." This attitude reflected decades of Soviet strategic thinking about Scandinavia. The narrow straits between Sweden and Denmark represented the Soviet Baltic fleet's only exit to the Atlantic. In any conflict with NATO, Soviet naval doctrine called for securing these passages immediately. Swedish neutrality was acceptable in peacetime, but in war, Sweden would either cooperate or be bypassed, by force if necessary. The Swedish perception was more complex, shaped by painful memories and pragmatic calculations. They had watched Finland fight the Soviet Union in 1939 and barely survive. They had seen the Baltic states disappear into the Soviet Union. Prime Minister Thorbjörn Fälldin, leading Sweden's first center-right government in 40 years, articulated Sweden's official position in 1979. "We are neutral, but we are not defenseless. We maintain our independence through strength, not through anyone's goodwill." Swedish military intelligence, Försvarets radioanstalt, FRA, had been detecting anomalies in their waters since the 1960s. Mysterious sonar contacts, unexplained damage to underwater cables, fishing nets torn in ways that suggested something large had passed through them. Defense Minister Eric Krönmark acknowledged in a classified 1976 report, We have reason to believe that foreign submarines regularly violate our territorial waters. The assumption must be that these are Soviet vessels conducting reconnaissance and training operations. But publicly confirming such violations would create a diplomatic crisis Sweden wasn't prepared for. Their strategy relied on ambiguity, maintaining enough military capability to make invasion costly, while avoiding provocations that might force the Soviet Union to act. As one Swedish naval officer later explained, "We knew they were there. They knew we knew. But as long as we didn't force them to the surface, both sides could maintain the useful fiction of Swedish neutrality." This comfortable ambiguity extended to Sweden's famous total defense doctrine. The Swedish military in 1980 was no lightweight force. They maintained one of the most advanced air forces in Europe, with domestically produced Viggen fighters that could operate from highway strips. They had a mobilization system that could put 700,000 soldiers in the field within 72 hours. Defense spending consumed 3% of GDP, comparable to many NATO nations. Yet, Swedish Admiral Per Rudberg wrote in his memoirs, "We optimized for deterrence, not for actual combat. Our whole strategy assumed that by the time submarines became a real problem, the Third World War would already be underway, and Sweden's sovereignty would be the least of anyone's concerns." The Soviets made similar calculations, but from the opposite direction. Sweden's neutrality is a strategic asset. Soviet Navy Commander Admiral Sergei Gorshkov argued in a 1977 planning document. In a conflict, NATO forces cannot use Swedish territory or waters as staging areas. This provides us with a protective buffer along the entire Baltic coast. Occasional reconnaissance missions are a small price for Sweden to pay for our tacit acceptance of their neutral status. Both sides were wrong. Neither understood how quickly their comfortable assumptions would shatter when a Soviet submarine ran aground in October 1981, unable to escape the very waters it had been secretly mapping for years. Sweden's submarine problem began long before the 1981 incident that would make international headlines. The origins traced back to the closing months of World War II, when Swedish coastal observers reported strange underwater contacts in the Stockholm archipelago. At the time, these were assumed to be German U-boats fleeing the collapsing Third Reich. But the contacts continued well after Germany's surrender, and they followed patterns that suggested deliberate reconnaissance rather than desperate escape. The first confirmed violation occurred in 1952, when Swedish destroyers forced an unidentified submarine to the surface near Herad. The vessel crash-dove before identification, but subsequent analysis of propeller sounds confirmed Soviet origin. Defense Minister Torsten Nilsson chose not to publicize the incident. "We protested through diplomatic channels," he later wrote, "but we did not want to escalate. The Cold War was young, and we hoped that firm but quiet objections would suffice." They wouldn't. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Swedish naval forces logged dozens of submarine contacts. The Swedish Navy developed specialized anti-submarine warfare capabilities, including advanced sonar arrays positioned throughout the archipelago. Commander Sven Carlson, who oversaw the sonar network expansion in 1968, explained, "We weren't preparing for war. We were preparing to prove violations were occurring. But proof required catching a submarine on the surface, preferably with its crew visible and its flag flying. Anything less was deniable." The strategic importance of Swedish waters grew throughout the Cold War. The Baltic Sea represented a geographic trap for the Soviet Baltic Fleet, powerful but landlocked. In peacetime, Soviet warships could transit through the Danish Straits, the Öresund, the Great Belt, and the Little Belt to reach the Atlantic. But in war, NATO naval doctrine called for blocking these passages immediately. Swedish neutrality meant the Soviet Navy couldn't pre-position forces west of Denmark, couldn't use Swedish ports for resupply, and couldn't rely on Swedish waters as a sanctuary. Or could they? Soviet naval planners looked at the map and saw opportunities. Sweden's eastern coast was a maze of thousands of islands, narrow channels, and hidden inlets. Perfect submarine terrain. If Soviet submarines could operate freely in Swedish waters, they could bypass NATO's planned choke points, conduct reconnaissance from positions NATO couldn't easily reach, and potentially strike at Norway's exposed northern flank. The Soviet Navy created a specialized unit for Baltic operations in 1965, the 161st Reconnaissance Detachment, based in Paldiski, Estonia. According to defector Viktor Suvorov's account in his 1984 book, Inside Soviet Military Intelligence, this unit's primary mission was mapping Swedish coastal waters. They would send diesel-electric submarines, usually Whiskey-class boats, on missions lasting 2 to 3 weeks. Suvorov wrote, the crews were specially trained in shallow water navigation. They carried detailed charts of Swedish defenses and were tasked with identifying potential landing sites for Spetsnaz forces. Swedish intelligence gradually pieced together what was happening. FRA intercepts revealed references to special operations in neutral waters. Defecting Soviet officers provided fragments of information. Swedish Navy analysis of submarine contact patterns showed that incursions increased before major Warsaw Pact exercises, suggesting reconnaissance missions to test Swedish response times and capabilities. In 1976, the Swedish government authorized a major upgrade to anti-submarine defenses. They installed fixed underwater detection systems at strategic points. They acquired new helicopters equipped with dipping sonar and magnetic anomaly detectors. They established rapid reaction forces trained specifically for submarine hunting. Vice Admiral Bror Stephenson, who oversaw the modernization, later admitted, "We were preparing for a confrontation we publicly insisted wasn't happening. The contradiction was unsustainable." The turning point came from an unexpected source. Polish naval officer Ryszard Kuklinski, who had been spying for the CIA since 1972. In late 1980, Kuklinski warned his American handlers that Warsaw Pact plans for invading Western Europe included detailed provisions for neutralizing Sweden. The assumption was that Sweden would either cooperate under pressure or be quickly overwhelmed in the war's opening hours, according to CIA documents declassified in 1998. Soviet submarines were preparing the ground. The CIA passed this intelligence to Sweden through carefully sanitized channels. Swedish military leadership now understood that submarine incursions weren't just reconnaissance. They were rehearsals for invasion. In March 1981, Prime Minister Fälldin authorized more aggressive rules of engagement. Swedish naval forces were permitted to use force if necessary to bring foreign submarines to the surface. 5 months later, they would get their chance. October 27, 1981. 22:15 hours, the Soviet submarine U-137, a Whiskey-class diesel-electric boat, lay grounded on rocks barely 1 kilometer from Sweden's largest naval base at Karlskrona. Lieutenant Commander Anatoly Gushin stood on the conning tower, watching Swedish patrol boats circle his stranded vessel like sharks. This was catastrophic. Not just the grounding, boats could be refloated. But the location made denial impossible. He was inside a restricted military zone, so close to Swedish shore installations that sailors on his deck could see Swedish officers watching them through binoculars. We were running on the surface, recharging batteries. Gushin would later tell Soviet naval investigators, according to documents that surfaced after the USSR's collapse. The navigation officer insisted we were in international waters. The charts showed our position as safe. I don't know whether the charts were wrong or whether we drifted further than calculated. When the bottom alarm sounded, we were already stuck. What Gushin didn't say, what couldn't be said in official reports. was that U-137 carried special equipment. Not weapons, but sensors. Devices for measuring magnetic signatures, for mapping underwater topography, for recording Swedish sonar frequencies. The mission had been routine. Approach Swedish waters, collect data on naval defenses, withdraw undetected. They had done it dozens of times. But this time, the rocks of the Gåsefjärden Strait caught them, at low tide, during a full moon, within sight of Sweden's most sensitive military installation. October 28, 1981. Oda several hours. When dawn broke over Karlskrona, Swedish naval officers aboard the destroyer Holland could hardly believe what they were seeing. A Soviet submarine, fully surfaced, crew members visible on deck, stuck fast on the rocks. Commander Sven-Olof Kviman, first officer of the Holland, later described the scene. She was listing about 15 degrees to port. The crew had put fenders over the side to protect the hull from the rocks. They were trying to act casual, as if being grounded in a foreign naval base was perfectly normal Soviet behavior. Within hours, the incident became an international crisis. Swedish Foreign Minister Ola Ullsten summoned the Soviet ambassador and delivered a formal protest. This is not an inadvertent border crossing. This is a deliberate violation of Swedish sovereignty in a militarily restricted zone. We demand an explanation. The Soviet response came quickly. Too quickly, Swedish intelligence analysts noted. It was clearly a prepared cover story, one analyst wrote in an internal report. They claimed navigation error, immediately offered apologies, and requested assistance in refloating the vessel. The speed of their response suggested they had contingency plans for this exact scenario. But the Swedish government had plans too. Prime Minister Fälldin convened an emergency cabinet meeting. Defense Minister Torsten Gustafsson argued for maximum exploitation of the incident. For years, we've known about submarine violations. Now we have proof. A Soviet submarine on our rocks, unable to deny its presence. We must board her. We must inspect her. We need to know what she was doing here. October 28 to 29, 1981. The standoff for 36 hours. U-137 remained grounded while Swedish and Soviet officials negotiated. The Soviets insisted on immediate assistance in refloating. The Swedes insisted on boarding for inspection. Neither side would yield. Swedish intelligence detected increased Soviet naval activity throughout the Baltic. Additional submarines were operating nearby. Swedish sonar tracked at least 3 more contacts in the approaches to Karlskrona. They were either preparing to assist U-137's escape or ensuring we couldn't conduct a thorough inspection, Admiral Stephenson concluded. Swedish military divers went into the water around U-137, ostensibly to assess damage to Swedish installations, but actually to examine the submarine's hull. They found the magnetic sensors, sophisticated equipment that had no legitimate purpose on a navigation error mission. Lieutenant Per Erlandsson, one of the divers, later testified, "We found equipment attached to the hull that was clearly for intelligence gathering. This wasn't a submarine that got lost. This was a submarine on a spying mission that got caught." The radiation question emerged on October 29th. Swedish inspectors requested permission to board U-137 and check for nuclear weapons or propulsion, officially for safety reasons, but actually to determine the submarine's full capabilities. The Soviets refused absolutely. "You have no right to board a vessel of the Soviet Navy," Ambassador Viktor Mikhailovich Makarov stated. "International law protects sovereign vessels even in foreign territorial waters." Swedish radiation detection teams conducted external measurements and detected anomalous readings. Years later, it would be revealed that U-137 carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes, a fact that, had it been confirmed at the time, would have triggered an even more severe crisis. A nuclear weapons incident just 1 kilometer from Sweden's largest naval base could have forced Sweden to abandon neutrality and seek NATO protection. November 3rd, 1981. The release. After 6 days of diplomatic confrontation, the Swedish government made a pragmatic decision. Soviet tugboats would be permitted to pull U-137 free, and the submarine would be escorted out of Swedish waters. The Swedes never got their boarding inspection. They never confirmed the nuclear torpedoes. They never fully documented the intelligence equipment. But they made sure the world knew what had happened. Swedish photographers documented everything. Television cameras captured Soviet sailors on deck, clearly embarrassed. Newspapers published maps showing exactly how far inside Swedish territory the submarine had grounded. Prime Minister Fälldin gave a televised address. This incident proves what we have long suspected. Foreign powers are violating Swedish neutrality. This must stop. It will not be tolerated. The Soviet response was a masterclass in Cold War minimalism. TASS, the official Soviet news agency, reported, a Soviet submarine experienced navigation difficulties in the Baltic Sea. The Swedish side rendered assistance. The matter is resolved. No apology, no acknowledgement of violation, no explanation of what a Soviet submarine was doing inside a Swedish naval base. Captain Gushin faced court-martial in Leningrad. According to naval officers who attended, the proceedings focused entirely on the failure to avoid detection, not on the mission itself. The problem wasn't that he was in Swedish waters, one officer recalled. The problem was that he got caught. The U-137 incident, quickly nicknamed Whiskey on the Rocks by Western media, transformed Swedish defense policy overnight. Within weeks, Sweden announced a series of measures that would have been politically impossible before the grounding. Defense spending increased by 12%. Anti-submarine forces were expanded and given new authority. Most dramatically, Sweden began what would become the most ambitious military construction project in its modern history, hollowing out mountains to create invulnerable naval bases. The Swedish response: building the mountain navy. In January 1982, the Swedish parliament approved funding for Muskö Naval Base, a facility that would be carved entirely from solid rock inside Muskö Mountain, south of Stockholm. The project was unprecedented in scale. Engineers would excavate 1.5 million cubic meters of granite to create a 300-meter-long dock capable of servicing destroyers and submarines simultaneously. The underground harbor would be protected by 200 meters of solid rock overhead, enough to survive a direct nuclear strike. We were thinking about survival, explained project director Captain Bo Rask in a 1985 interview. If the Soviet Union invaded Sweden, conventional bases would be destroyed in the opening hours. But if we could hide our fleet inside mountains, we could continue operations indefinitely. Submarines based in Muskö could attack Soviet supply lines in the Baltic for months after the surface war was lost. The engineering challenges were extraordinary. Workers used controlled explosions to fracture the granite, then excavated the debris through tunnels bored horizontally into the mountain. They installed massive steel doors at the harbor entrance, 60 tons each, designed to seal shut in minutes if attack was imminent. They built a complete city inside the mountain: fuel storage, ammunition magazines, workshops, living quarters for 1,000 personnel, even a hospital. Muskö became operational in 1987, but it was only the centerpiece of a broader defensive network. Sweden built hardened submarine pens at Berga Naval Base, underground command centers throughout the archipelago, and mobile missile batteries positioned on islands throughout the Stockholm approaches. By 1990, Sweden had spent over 8 billion kroner, creating the infrastructure for indefinite resistance against Soviet invasion. The submarine hunt intensifies between 1981 and 1992. Swedish naval forces conducted 6,000 hours of anti-submarine operations annually. They detected hundreds of suspected submarine contacts. They dropped depth charges on 225 separate occasions. In October 1982, they conducted a massive operation in Hårsfjärden, a bay south of Stockholm, where multiple submarines were detected operating for several days. Rear Admiral Krister Kierkegaard commanded the Hårsfjärden operation. His report, declassified in 2015, described a cat-and-mouse game in Swedish territorial waters. We had multiple sonar contacts, multiple visual sightings of periscopes and snorkels. The submarines were deliberately evading us, hiding in thermal layers, using the complex bottom topography. When we dropped depth charges, they moved. When we reposited, they appeared elsewhere. This wasn't training. This was operational intelligence gathering by an organized force. Swedish defense planners developed new tactics specifically for hunting submarines in shallow archipelago waters. They deployed seafloor sensors that could detect magnetic anomalies from submarine hulls. They used helicopters to create sonar barriers across channels. They experimented with trained seals, yes, actual seals, that could potentially detect submarines using their natural sensing abilities. The SEAL program was abandoned after mixed results. The psychological impact on Swedish society was profound. Submarine sightings became front-page news. Citizens reported periscopes, strange underwater sounds, divers in military equipment emerging from the sea. Some sightings were legitimate. Others were misidentifications of seals, logs, or recreational submarines. The Swedish government struggled to maintain credibility while admitting they couldn't stop the violations. Soviet adaptations. Smaller, quieter, more sophisticated Soviet naval intelligence adapted to Sweden's enhanced defenses by changing tactics. The Whiskey-class boats that U-137 represented were obsolete. Large, noisy, relatively easy to detect. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, shifted to using midget submarines for Baltic reconnaissance missions. According to documents from Russian naval archives accessed by researchers in the late 1990s, the Soviet Navy deployed several classes of mini-submarines specifically for operations in Scandinavian waters. These included the Triton 1M, a 30-ton midget submarine carrying a crew of 3, designed for inserting special forces teams. The Piranha, a 50-ton vessel optimized for shallow water intelligence gathering. Various unmanned submersibles for planting sensors or mines. These smaller submarines could operate in water depths impossible for conventional boats. They could hide in narrow channels between islands. They could approach Swedish installations from unexpected directions. Swedish Admiral Krister Kierkegaard admitted in 1985, "Our defenses were optimized for larger submarines. When they shifted to midget boats, we had to recalibrate our entire detection network." The Soviets also developed new operational security procedures. Documents revealed that submarine commanders received detailed briefings on Swedish sensor locations. They carried special navigation charts showing safe approach routes through Swedish defenses. They maintained strict radio silence, using only underwater acoustic communication systems that Swedish forces struggled to intercept. Western intelligence and the debate. The submarine incidents created tension between Sweden and NATO. American intelligence services were convinced the intruders were Soviet, based on signal intelligence and acoustic signatures. Swedish officials agreed, publicly. But privately, some Swedish military analysts questioned whether all the incursions were Soviet. A classified 1983 report by the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOA, noted, "Some acoustic signatures do not match known Soviet submarine classes. Some operational patterns differ from Soviet naval doctrine. We cannot exclude the possibility that some violations are conducted by other parties." potentially Western intelligence services testing our defenses or conducting their own reconnaissance operations. This theory remained controversial. Critics argued it was deflection, an attempt to avoid confronting the Soviet threat. Supporters pointed to later revelations about NATO's secret stay-behind networks in neutral countries, which sometimes operated without those countries' full knowledge or consent. The truth remained murky. The CIA provided Sweden with intelligence assistance, tracking Soviet submarine deployments, sharing acoustic data, even providing advanced sonar technology. But this assistance came with unstated conditions. As one Swedish intelligence officer noted anonymously in a 2000 interview, the Americans would help us track Soviet submarines, but they also wanted to know everything we learned about Soviet capabilities. We were neutral in name, but in the intelligence war, we were Western partners. The costs mount by 1985. Sweden's submarine defense operations consumed 15% of the naval budget. The economic strain was significant, but the political strain was worse. Sweden's self-image as a neutral nation above Cold War confrontations was shattered. Opinion polls showed 72% of Swedes believed their government should take stronger action against submarine violations, but nobody could agree on what stronger action meant. Some politicians advocated joining NATO. Others called for developing nuclear weapons to ensure deterrence. A few suggested declaring permanent exclusion zones where any submarine would be attacked without warning. All these proposals failed. They would have ended Swedish neutrality, the very thing the submarine defenses were meant to protect. The submarines kept coming. The hunt continued. And deep inside Muskö mountain, Sweden's navy prepared for a war everyone hoped would never arrive. February 1992. The Cold War ends. The questions remain. When the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, Swedish defense officials expected answers. Surely now, with Russia opening archives and Soviet officers publishing memoirs, the truth about the submarine incursions would finally emerge. They would learn how many missions had been conducted, what intelligence was gathered, how close Sweden came to being invaded. Instead, they got denials, contradictions, and a mystery that persists to this day. The Swedish Submarine Commission, established in 1995 to investigate the incursions, interviewed former Soviet naval officers and reviewed declassified documents. Their findings were simultaneously conclusive and frustrating. Yes, Soviet submarines had violated Swedish waters. U-137 proved that definitively. Yes, intelligence-gathering missions occurred regularly through the 1970s and 1980s. But the scale, frequency, and purpose remained disputed. Former Soviet Navy officers like Admiral Valery Aleksin admitted to reconnaissance missions, but insisted they were limited and defensive. We needed to know Swedish capabilities in case war came to Scandinavia. But we never planned to invade Sweden. The submarines were intelligence assets, not invasion preparation. Other evidence suggested more aggressive intentions. Swedish investigators found documents indicating that Soviet naval Spetsnaz forces had practiced landing operations on Swedish territory, not on Swedish soil, but rehearsals using similar coastline in Soviet-controlled territories. Soviet war plans discovered after 1991 showed invasion routes through Swedish waters. Though whether these were serious operational plans or theoretical contingencies remained unclear. The midget submarine question produced the most contentious debates. Swedish sonar operators had detected dozens of small submarine contacts between 1982 and 1990. Too small to be conventional submarines, displaying characteristics unlike known Soviet vessels. In 2015, the Swedish military displayed what they claimed was a Russian midget submarine rescue beacon recovered from Swedish waters in 1983. Russian officials denied any knowledge of the beacon. The human cost of vigilance. The submarine hunt extracted a toll beyond budgets and diplomatic tensions. Swedish Navy officers spent years on high alert, tracking contacts that sometimes proved real, sometimes proved false, and sometimes remained unresolved. Lieutenant Commander Anders Grenholm, who commanded anti-submarine operations in the Stockholm archipelago from 1984 to 1988, described the psychological strain in his 2003 memoir. We would track a contact for days, deploy all our assets, drop depth charges worth millions of kroner, then lose the target and wonder if we'd actually had anything at all. The uncertainty was maddening. Were we defending our nation or chasing ghosts? Some days we couldn't tell. 3 Swedish naval personnel died in submarine-related incidents during the 1980s. 2 in a helicopter crash during anti-submarine operations. 1 when a sonar buoy exploded prematurely. Soviet submarine crews faced their own dangers. At least 1 Soviet submarine accident occurred in the Baltic during this period, though Russian authorities never confirmed whether the incident was related to Swedish operations. The strategic legacy: how Muskö changed naval warfare. The mountain naval base at Muskö represented a unique Cold War innovation, a navy designed not for power projection, but for survival. When fully operational, Muskö could support sustained submarine operations even after Sweden's surface bases were destroyed. The strategic logic was grimly realistic. In a nuclear war, Sweden's navy wouldn't win battles, but it could continue harassing Soviet supply lines long enough to matter. Foreign naval observers studied Muskö with fascination. Norwegian military planners visited and considered similar hardened facilities for their own navy. China reportedly sent engineers to study Swedish mountain excavation techniques. Even the U.S. Navy examined whether hardened submarine pens might protect their nuclear missile boats from Soviet first strikes. But Muskö's real significance was political. Building a navy inside a mountain was an admission that Swedish neutrality had failed as a protective strategy. You don't hollow out mountains unless you expect your country to become a battlefield. The facility's existence, so elaborate, so expensive, so clearly designed for wartime resistance, demonstrated that Sweden had chosen sides. They remained officially neutral, but they were prepared to fight on the western side if war came. Post-Cold War revelations and new submarine hunts. The submarine incidents didn't end with the Cold War. In October 2014, Swedish forces conducted a week-long submarine hunt in the Stockholm archipelago after civilians reported periscope sightings and intelligence suggested a damaged submarine was operating in Swedish waters. Over 200 naval personnel searched using advanced sonar, helicopters, and even Swedish Navy frogmen. They found nothing conclusive, though acoustic analysis suggested a small submarine had indeed been present. Swedish intelligence officials stated publicly they believed the submarine was Russian, an assessment that Russia denied. The incident sparked international attention and reinforced Sweden's decision to strengthen military ties with NATO, though still not formally joining the alliance. In 2018, Sweden did what had been unthinkable during the Cold War. They applied for NATO membership. Finland applied simultaneously. Both applications explicitly cited submarine violations and broader Russian military assertiveness as justification. Sweden's 210-year tradition of neutrality formally ended when they joined NATO in March 2024, with Finland following shortly after. The commander of Muskö Naval Base in 2015, Captain Jonas Hagren, reflected on the facility's evolution. We built this to survive a Soviet invasion that never came. Now we maintain it because Russian submarines still probe our defenses. The threat has changed, but it hasn't disappeared. Muskö remains relevant not because we expected the Cold War to last forever, but because we understood that Sweden's geography makes us strategically significant regardless of who rules in Moscow. The numbers tell part of the story. Between 1981 and 1992, Sweden documented 131 submarine incursions they considered confirmed, dropped depth charges 225 times, and spent over 12 billion kroner, approximately $1.5 billion in 1992 dollars, on anti-submarine operations. They never sank a submarine. They never captured another crew after U-137. They never stopped the incursions completely. Today, tourists can visit Muskö Naval Base on guided tours, walking through the massive underground docks and imagining what it would have meant if Sweden had fought the war those facilities were designed for. The tours skip the operational sections. Much of Muskö remains an active military installation, housing Swedish submarines and supporting ongoing Baltic security operations. The submarine incidents of the 1980s revealed fundamental truths about Cold War neutrality. Sweden's experience demonstrated that, in a bipolar world, claiming neutrality didn't make you neutral. It made you a prize that both sides sought to influence, a strategic asset that neither side would truly respect. Soviet submarine commanders saw Swedish waters as necessary reconnaissance areas. NATO planners saw Sweden as a potential ally, too valuable to remain neutral in wartime. Sweden's attempt to remain aloof from the superpower rivalry failed not because they lacked military capability, but because geography and strategic logic made their neutrality inconvenient for both sides. The lessons extend beyond Sweden. The submarine hunts showed how modern surveillance technology paradoxically increased Cold War tensions by making covert operations more detectable, but not more preventable. Swedish forces could track Soviet submarines far more effectively than in the 1950s or 1960s. But this detection capability didn't give them the ability to stop the violations. Instead, it created a politically untenable situation, where the Swedish public knew their waters were being violated, but their government couldn't prevent it. Perhaps most significantly, the Swedish submarine experience illustrated the psychological dimensions of Cold War deterrence. Building Muskö sent a clear signal: Sweden would resist invasion. The facility's existence suggested that occupation would be costly, prolonged, and possibly futile if the Swedish Navy could continue operations from invulnerable bases. This was deterrence through demonstrated will rather than overwhelming force, a strategy accessible to smaller nations facing superpower threats. When Captain Lars Höglund retired from the Swedish Navy in 1995, he reflected on the October 1981 grounding that had transformed Sweden's defense posture. "We thought catching U-137 would stop the violations. Instead, it just made everyone admit what had been happening all along. Maybe that was more important, ending the pretense that neutrality meant safety." The submarine is gone now, scrapped in a Soviet naval yard. But the Mountain Navy base remains, a Cold War monument carved in granite, still housing Swedish submarines that still patrol Baltic waters, still watching for foreign submarines that still occasionally appear on Swedish sonar. The Cold War ended, but in the Baltic archipelago, the submarine hunt continues. Because geography is permanent, strategic interests are persistent, and some lessons are too expensive to forget. The underwater cat-and-mouse game that began in the 1940s intensified dramatically after 1981 and shaped an entire generation of Swedish defense policy has never truly ended. It has only changed players, refined tactics, and adapted to new technologies. Sweden built a navy inside a mountain to survive a war that never came. But the fact that they built it at all tells you everything about how seriously they took the threat. And in the dark waters between Sweden's rocky islands, somewhere beneath the Baltic's cold surface, that seriousness is probably still justified.